Hi, this is going to be like the other video I made a little while ago, the essay. This is going to be an essay on walking. And I didn't think about this too much before I decided to do this video because kind of interested myself in how it will turn out. And that's, uh, I think, where I'll start with it because um, I always feel like I'm not good at walking. Of course, I can walk like anyone else, with my feet and legs, but like the relation walking has with literature or thinking even is usually walking is like a meditative thing. I've heard a lot of sports people say that like a repetitive action like running or walking or even lifting weights is like meditative or calming. But I've always felt that I'm not very good at that. Meaning that I can't really get in a good continual stream. And what kind of got me thinking about this specifically recently was, so I was kind of thinking about what to write. I usually don't do it this way, but I was trying to write. I usually just wait until I want to and then do it because I've found much better results that way. But I was thinking, okay, I want to write right now. So I was thinking about what I should write about. And what I came up with after, a couple hours of thinking, I only ended up writing 2 lines. But I think what came out of it was more valuable than the 2 lines. Well, it definitely was. And the idea was, so first of all, it was about Miklos Senkuthi, who is a Hungarian author, born in like, I can't remember, 1906, something like that. Hungarian guy. Published his first novel when he was 26 in the mid 30s. It's like a landmark of Hungarian modernism compared to Proust and Joyce, etc., etc. Died in 1988. But I really didn't have a good reason for wanting to write about him. It was kind of like, I guess, an intuition, and I just went ahead and did it. But I wanted to learn more about what he was doing while he was writing his first book, Prey, because I had been reading that book a little bit, and it's an extremely fascinating book, but it is quite dense, and he published it when he was 26. So I was just curious what he had been doing, and I found out he was a teacher at a gymnasium, which I guess would be compared to like a middle school and high school, from what I gather. And so I wanted to do something like that, like talk about that a little. And he taught in Budapest. And what I imagined with the scene was like a school day just ended, and he's sitting at his desk, like kind of packing up, I guess, probably early to mid-afternoon. And he packed a couple books. He was really, he went to England for 1 year, I think 1931 to 1932. Went to England for a year, so he became, an expert in English literature. I think he was a translator of John Donne. He was a translator of Thomas Browne. He was a translator of, I think, some of the English essayists into Hungarian. So he was an expert in that, and of course I really like those guys too, and I'll get to that a little later because I think it's related to this. But so I had him put his, Thomas Browne and John Donne into his briefcase, and then I had him put a couple pages of his manuscript of Prey into the thing too. And then the plan was basically just to have him walk around, walk around Budapest and go through his thoughts. But I only actually wrote down 2 sentences, which was basically, him packing his stuff in his briefcase and heading out to the periphery of Budapest. But what I thought of basically was the idea of walking, because I've been really interested in the discursive sort of prose style that is most related to like that English Renaissance Baroque literature, at least for me. Robert Burton, Thomas Browne, John Donne, his I can't remember the name of them right now, but his prose essays about like suffering and death and being ill. And then a little later you get Lawrence Sterne, who does it really well, and one of his favorite authors was Burton. Then you gradually get to the English essayists that can lead you to W.G. Sebald, who is famous for his walking literature, The Rings of Saturn. And you also can include Rousseau, Reveries of a Solitary Walker, or his Confessions. And then those couple, stragglers in the middle lead you from the Baroque styling of the English Renaissance, and then they lead you to the modernist era, which is the next like major landmark of that discursive stream of consciousness style. And that's kind of what I was thinking of. And, I thought of this after I had that intuition or vision of Saint Cuthie with his books. But, it actually fits quite well because Prey does not have a plot, like at all. And the character is not very, it's not like a Bildungsroman or something like that. It's not like a growth of the character and you follow the character and there's conflict that way. It's his second book he published is called Towards the One and Only Metaphor, which is a series of like aphorisms and short essays. And the very last one he wrote about Thomas Browne and the French author Mauriac. But one of the main ideas in it is he talked about Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. And what he emphasized in it was the idea that language is basically, to put it, language is the main character. It's interesting. I didn't think about this, but I just read an interview with Enrique Villamatas, who also really writes in this style. I think his best book for me is Bartleby and Co. that goes in this way. It talks about writers who didn't write or stopped writing, and even makes up some writers. But what he said in the essay was, I think someone asked him like, why do you write, or what are your books about, something like that, and he said, someone said about Joyce, his Finnegan's Wake, that if someone asked you what it's about, and he said it's not about something, it is the something, and that's pretty interesting. That because I really feel Joyce does continue that discursive literature tradition with his book Ulysses, at least, and then if you can continue to Finnegan's Wake. And then, of course, you have Proust, who does it. You have Musil, who does it. Who else? I mean, basically all the good ones, all the good ones, and Fernando Pessoa, who himself was a famous flaneur or walker, and yeah, I just think it's interesting because there must be something to it, to walking, because of course people have always done it, especially when people needed horses to go around places, but now in our first worlds where cars are relatively easy to get, especially in America where it's almost a requirement for a vehicle. People in Europe don't have to drive or whatever as much, but people in America, it's almost implied that you drive places because everything's so far away. But today, I only had one class, and the campus that I go to is centrally located in the town I live in. So I was gonna just walk back to my apartment, which is a short walk, and get in my car and drive where I wanted to go. But I decided to be extravagant today and take the long route, which ended up being a 15-minute walk instead of walking 3 minutes to my car and then driving 3 minutes. Taking the efficient route. I decided to walk, and unfortunately, I didn't have any epiphanies on the walk, so it may not have been valuable, but I did think about this subject, and my two favorite time periods in literature are like concentrated time periods are the Baroque English Renaissance period and then the modernist era. And I always try to think about why. Like why in the context of what created them, and also why would I like them? Because they're very similar. They had, like huge concentrations of genius. The ones in the English Renaissance are more, I guess, generally accepted. You have Shakespeare, you have Marlowe, you have John Donne, you have Thomas Browne. Maybe Burton's a little less popular, but I think they're all generally considered geniuses, one way or another. And then you have the modernists, who I guess are less, less securely placed because they're only 100 years ago. But Joyce is widely considered a genius, I would expect. And then you have people like Proust, who are pretty widely accepted, and then Musil also, and then whoever else. But then really any other time you have maybe one sprinkled here and there. Like you have Lawrence Sterne, you have maybe Alexander Pope, then you have maybe a romantic here and there, whoever else, but it's more like spotty. Maybe you have Goethe, something like that. But it's odd that these two times had such concentrations of it. And then it's also odd that, I like those two times. And, maybe I'm being somewhat particular, that I could be ignoring other groups that people would consider genius, like, I know Victorian literature is quite popular in these parts. And, I don't know, I could never enjoy Victorian literature much for whatever reason. I like Robert Browning a lot, but... And then there's also like postmodern that I like to an extent, but I don't really like. But that's there's like huge followings, well, relatively huge, on Goodreads and Instagram. There's these groups of people who, like, their favorite books are all postmodern writers. Pynchon, Coover, whoever else. Yeah, but back to my original thing, there must be something about walking, because a lot of these, and this is something I've noticed before that I did read a book about, a lot of these modernist books focus one way or another on walking, and that's not really surprising. There was this funny thing in my McCarthy class last semester. This one kid was trying to be like a literary sleuth, like, oh, I noticed I notice there's always a river in McCarthy's books. Like what does it mean? And then my teacher was like, well, when you have a 300-page book that's set in Tennessee or Texas, and the ones in Texas cross the Texas-Mexico border quite frequently, you're going to encounter a river. Like it's not like McCarthy had to be like, okay, how am I going to fit this river in the story? You'd have to do the opposite to avoid a river. So I don't want to go that far to say, oh man, why are all these guys before we had cars talking about walking so much? Probably they walked for hours each day, if they had to do anything. So it's obvious why walking would be a central topic to them, but I'm sure sitting in a chair, they probably sat down a lot, but they didn't write about that nearly as much. Or like being stuck in a room, like that one guy, voyages or journey around my bedroom or whatever it is, which is, basically playing on the idea that he's stuck in his room, but you can't trap him there because he can have a journey in his own room. Just have to use his imagination. But yeah, I don't really have any final thoughts on the matter. I did kind of want to go into another thing that I've been thinking about, because I had to take this general class that every transfer student or freshman has to take. And the class is called Paratext, or the Art of Commentary. And it seems like it'll be interesting. The first book we have to read is it's like the Lifespan of a Fact or something like that, by John D'Agata, who's a creative journalist, literary critic. Then we have to read a commentary by Servius on the fourth book of Virgil's Aeneid. And then we're reading Pale Fire. And what I gather from the class is we're going to look at how things around a text affect the interpretation of it. So footnotes, title pages, introductions, endnotes, front and back cover, page numbers, I suppose. But then I also think it'd be interesting to include like outer commentaries or books about books. And I've always noticed with myself that I tend to avoid those things. Like I almost always skip introductions to books, like in the front of books. I very rarely read notes. If I see those little numbers by a word that, like number 27 as a note, I almost never read them. And I think that may be somewhat arrogant to an extent, because I generally take the opinion that I don't need someone explaining something to me for me to enjoy it, or even for me to understand it. And I think that may be somewhat arrogant, and maybe somewhat a product of my time, because one interesting thing this teacher said is, he said, back in the past, the assumption was that you would need commentary to be able to understand a book. Like how the preachers or whoever else, clergymen would. The assumption was the Bible's in Latin, so it must be explained to common people. And then, of course, they translated it to the vernacular languages, and that was removed slightly. But then they still needed commentaries about books, like, what is it? What are those things? Exegesis on something, or whatever it is. An explanation on things, or a whole book on one book of the Bible. So that was still an assumption that, those were needed. And then it was still, almost, from what I can tell, the case, because a lot of authors like Thomas Brown, he wrote little notes on the margins of his essays. And then you have like even Robert Browning in his excuse me, in his epic poem, or maybe just his long poems, he had little notes in them. But nowadays, shoot, gotta sit up. Nowadays, the assumption is that you should just be able to read it. Like, I think people would get bored by notes and they would skip them. Like in a newspaper, news article, or in a tweet, or whatever. Hyperlinks. It's to the extent that people only read titles; they don't even read the actual thing. So I think, yeah, I could be affected by that. I could be, a product of my time, which I could be to an extent, but I don't think that would fit with the type of books that I'm reading. Because I think generally the books that I'm reading are more difficult than the secondary literature would be. So it can't be related to difficulty. And if anything, if the secondary literature is more difficult, I would maybe be more inclined to read it. Because, related to masochism or whatever else. I just say that jokingly. I don't think I'm a masochist, but I do enjoy struggle. Because I think it says at the end of the Spinoza's Ethics that, if good things were easy, we wouldn't value them. So it's lucky that they aren't, That's like a, rough paraphrase. I would recommend just reading it. It's, I think, the very last page of Spinoza's Ethics, very last paragraph. But, yeah, so this idea of paratext or commentary, I have to say I don't care much for it. Like, I like the idea of it. Like, recently, The Recognitions is one of the best books I've read, so I got this book by Stephen Moore about the Recognitions, like, can't remember what it's called exactly, but basically a reader's guide to the Recognitions. And I was like, man, that would be interesting. Like, I'd learn all these little things that I missed. But I got reading it, and it was, I didn't care. I was reading, this quote here, it implies a reference to this 18th century art history book that talks about, the saint from the 3rd century or whatever. And I'm just like, okay, that's like mildly interesting. That's maybe like a sip of a drink type of interesting. But in that moment, I would have rather been reading the Recognitions, even if I missed that reference. So, and another thing that got me thinking about this is I just found this guy on YouTube. I guess he's a professor of literature and creative writing, but he made a YouTube channel because he seems like he's to an extent sick of how he has to teach. So he's kind of taking a more loose aspect to teaching literature, and he does still call them lectures, because I think he's been doing it for so long he's still stuck in that mindset. But he is doing a run through of Ulysses without any secondary material. He said all you need is the book Ulysses and then the last short story in Dubliners, The Dead. You only need those 2 texts, and that's all. And he's doing a whole run through of them. And that's actually one book that I thought of when this teacher was talking about paratext, because it's so like heavily, like, people are like, oh, do I have to read the Odyssey before I read Ulysses? Or like, do I have to read Hamlet? And all this stuff. And I guess I'm kind of lucky that I never cared about any of that. And I think it is to an extent related to arrogance, or like somewhat confidence. Because one interesting thing, I had this Spanish teacher. She's one of my favorite teachers I've ever had. and she was very, very good teacher, very helpful, one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. But we talked one time, and at the time I was reading some Spanish poet. I think it was Machado, and I was reading him in Spanish. And I told her that because I was really enjoying it, and she said to me that she could never really get into poets or like literature, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Juan Rulfo or any of those guys, because she was intimidated by it. And that struck me as being, for me personally, being so unusual. I've never felt intimidated by books. I mean, sure, I've gotten into a book and been like, oh shit, like, I'm not understanding anything. Yeah, I've done that. But I never felt intimidated. But in the opposite way, so like in still this conversation, I was sitting there thinking like, because she had told me she loves talking to people. Like, she can talk to anybody. And she was one of those people where she could walk up to anyone and you would just love talking to her, and you just loved hearing her story. She was just such a nice and like pleasant person. I'm sure she could make anyone enjoy talking to her. And I've never really felt that way, at least to that extent, not even close. And I get intimidated talking to people. So I thought, like, isn't that weird? Isn't that weird? She's intimidated by books, and I'm completely not intimidated by books ever at all. And I'm intimidated talking to people, but she is not at all. And I would say that people are much more complex than books. Like, easily. So I think that's interesting that she was intimidated by books. Because I've always had, like, ever since I first started getting into books, I saw people asking, should I read the Odyssey to understand Joyce? Or there's this joke on this website with philosophy that you have to start with the Greeks, so you don't miss any references. Like, there's this like silly saying, all Western philosophy is just like annotations or footnotes to Plato, which is really like pretty silly. And it's obvious the utility of doing that. It's obvious the utility of being able to recognize all the little things, because there was this time that they really showed it to me, that the utility of it. Me and this guy, we were reading Wittgenstein's Tractatus, and it was basically just like a goofy thing. Like, I was basically running on like 4 hours of sleep and had been awake for 20 hours, and this guy was, I think he was tired too, and we were just like, like, screw it, let's just read it, see how it goes. Because he was like a philosophy guy, like he went to school for philosophy, and yeah, so we were going through it, and I was understanding it to the extent that I could. I mean, it's mostly like definition and then an extrapolation on a definition. So, I mean, pretty much anyone can understand that if you can learn words. But there would be times where I couldn't understand something, like he would mention colors, like he would do these like slight, like slights, like sleight of hand type sleight of phrase on color, and I didn't know that was related to Aristotle. But the guy that got a degree in philosophy was like, oh yeah, I think he's referencing Aristotle here and what he said about color. And then he went and he told me about color, Aristotle's view of color and how that relates to what Wittgenstein was saying, and that helped me understand it. And I don't think I would have been able to continue reading the Tractatus without knowing that precise connotation of color related to Aristotle. So that really showed me precisely like how starting with the Greeks, so to say, would help you with literature or philosophy. But um, and I think it makes perfect sense, and it's obvious. But I think also people can get bogged down very easily with it. I was always somewhat distraught that because I love John Keats. He was one of the first guys I really loved, and I know Borges was like that. John Keats was one of the first poets he really loved, and I've always enjoyed that. But with Keats, he uses a lot of references to classical mythology, or talks about Milton. A lot of proper nouns. Capital letters, and I was always somewhat dismayed by that because I was like, well, it would be so much more. It would be transcendent if he didn't do that, and that's correct. But it's also less precise, because if he mentions Milton, and if the person's relatively knowledgeable about the history of literature, you can really get some precise feelings by even mentioning the name Milton, which you couldn't do by saying genius or great man or intelligent person or whatever, great writer, in place of the word Milton, which is really what he was doing in the poem. So when I was younger, when I didn't know anything, I was like, yeah, it'd be good. It'd be good if you didn't have to know these references, or if he didn't use them. But now it's kind of torn, because a lot of these surrealist guys, dreamlike works, they use like symbols of the moon or whatever to give precise connotations or meanings to things. But then Pessoa talks about this so perfectly, and that's one poem I read on this channel because I love it so much. Symbols. I'm sick of symbols, Yeah, it's just and that kind of I want to continue with Pessoa because he was a notorious walker around Lisbon, and he was also pretty well known, like he says in the beginning of the Book of Disquiet, that he would just sit in cafes and watch people. And one of my favorite poems of his is called The Tobacco Shop. And I think I'm just going to go ahead and read it. It is somewhat of a long poem, but I love it so much, and then I'll probably be getting pretty close to ending after I read it. But here it is. And it's from Fernando Pessoa and Co., the selected poems translated by Richard Zenith. So this is The Tobacco Shop. I'm nothing. I'll always be nothing. I can't want to be something, but I have in me all the dreams of the world. Windows of my room, the room of one of the world's millions nobody knows. And if they knew me, what would they know? You open onto the mystery of a street continually crossed by people, a street inaccessible to any and every thought, real, impossibly real, certain, unknowingly certain, with the mystery of things behind the stones and beings, with death making the walls damp and the hair of men white, with destiny driving the wagon of everything down the road of nothing. Today I'm defeated, as if I'd learned the truth. Today I'm lucid, as if I were about to die, and had no greater kinship with things than to say farewell, this building and this side of the street becoming a row of train cars, with the whistle for departure blowing in my head, and my nerves jolting, and bones creaking as we pull out. Today I'm bewildered, like a man who wondered and discovered and forgot. Today I'm torn between the loyalty I owe to the outward reality of the tobacco shop across the street and to the inward reality of my feeling that everything's a dream. I failed in everything. Since I had no ambition, perhaps I failed in nothing. I left the education I was given, climbing down the window at the back of the house. I went to the country with big plans, but all I found was grass and trees. And when there were people, they were just like the others. I step back from the window and sit in a chair. What should I think about? How should I know what I'll be, I who don't know what I am? Be what I think? But I think of being so many things. And there are so many who think of being the same thing that we can't all be it. Genius? At this moment, 100,000 brains are dreaming their geniuses like me, and it may be that history won't remember even one, all of their imagined conquests amounting to so much dung. No, I don't believe in me. Insane asylums are full of lunatics with certainties. Am I, who have no certainties, more right or less right? No, not even in me. In how many garrets and non-garrets of the world are self-convinced geniuses at this moment dreaming? How many lofty and noble and lucid aspirations, yes, truly lofty and noble and lucid and perhaps even attainable, will never see the true light of day or find a sympathetic ear? The world is for those born to conquer it, not for those who dream they can conquer it, even if they're right. I've done more in dreams than Napoleon. I've held more humanities against my hypothetical breast than Christ. I've secretly invented philosophy such as Kant never wrote. But I am, and perhaps will always be, the man in the garret, even though I don't live in one. I'll always be the one who wasn't born for that. I'll always be merely the one who had qualities. I'll always be the one who waited for a door to open in a wall without doors, and sang the song of the infinite in a chicken coop, and heard the voice of God in a covered well. Believe in me? No, not in anything. Let nature pour over my seething head its sun, its rain, and the wind that finds my hair, and let the rest come if it will or must, or let it not come. Cardiac slaves of the stars. We conquered the whole world before getting out of bed, but we woke up and it's hazy. We got up and it's alien. We went outside and it's the entire Earth, plus the solar system and the Milky Way and the indefinite. Eat your chocolates, little girl, eat your chocolates. Believe me, there's no metaphysics on earth like little chocolates. And all religions put together teach no more than the candy shop. Eat, dirty little girl, eat. If only I could eat chocolates with the same truth as you. But I think, and, removing the silver paper that's tinfoil, I throw it all on the ground, as I've thrown out life. But at least, from my bitterness over what I'll never be, there remains the hasty writing of these verses, a broken gateway to the impossible. But at least I confer on myself a contempt without tears, noble at least in the sweeping gesture by which I fling that dirty laundry that's me, with no list, into the stream of things, and I stay at home, shirtless. Oh, my consoler who doesn't exist and therefore consoles, be you a Greek goddess conceived as a living statue, or a patrician woman of Rome, impossibly noble and dire, or a princess of the troubadours, all charm and grace, or an 18th century marchioness, décolleté and aloof, or a famous courtesan from our parents' generation, or something modern, I can't quite imagine what. Whatever all of this is, whatever you are, if you can inspire, then inspire me. My heart is a poured-out bucket. In the same way invokers of spirits invoke spirits, I invoke my own self and find nothing. I go to the window and see the street with absolute clarity. I see the shops, I see the sidewalks, I see the passing cars. I see the clothed living beings who pass each other. I see the dogs that also exist. And all of this weighs on me like a sentence of exile. And all of this is foreign, like everything else. I've lived, studied, loved, and even believed. And today there is not a beggar I don't envy just because he isn't me. I look at the tatters and sores and falsehood of each one, and I think, perhaps you never lived or studied or loved or believed, for it's possible to do all of this without having done any of it. Perhaps you've merely existed, and when a lizard has its tail cut off and the tail keeps on twitching without the lizard. I made of myself what I was no good at making, and what I could have made of myself I didn't. I put on the wrong costume, and was immediately taken for someone I wasn't, and I said nothing, and was lost. When I went to take off the mask, it was stuck to my face. When I got it off and saw myself in the mirror, I had already grown old. I was drunk and no longer knew how to wear the costume that I hadn't taken off. I threw out the mask and slept in the closet, like a dog tolerated by the management because it's harmless, and I'll write down the story to prove I'm sublime. Musical essence of my useless verses. If only I could look at you as something I had made, instead of always looking at the tobacco shop across the street, trampling on my consciousness of existing, like a rug a drunkard stumbles on or a doormat stolen by gypsies, and it's not worth a thing. But the tobacco shop owner has come to the door and is standing there. I look at him with the discomfort of a half-twisted neck, compounded by the discomfort of a half-grasping soul. He will die, and I will die. He'll leave his signboard, I'll leave my poems. His sign will eventually also die, and so will my poems. Eventually the street where the sign was will die, and so will the language in which my poems were written. Then the whirling planet where all this happened will die. On other planets of other solar systems, something like people will continue to make things like poems and to live under things like signs. Always one thing facing the other. Always one thing as useless as the other. Always the impossible as stupid as reality. Always the inner mystery as true as the mystery sleeping on the surface. Always this thing or always that, or neither one thing nor the other. But a man has entered the tobacco shop to buy tobacco, and plausible reality suddenly hits me. I half rise from my chair, energetic, convinced, human, and will try to write these verses in which I say the opposite. I light up a cigarette as I think about writing them, and in that cigarette I savor of freedom from all thought. My eyes follow the smoke as if it were my own trail, and I enjoy, for a sensitive and fitting moment, a liberation from all speculation, and an awareness that metaphysics is a consequence of not feeling very well. Then I lean back in the chair and keep smoking. As long as destiny permits, I'll keep smoking. If I married my washerwoman's daughter, perhaps I would be happy. I get up from the chair, I go to the window. The man has come out of the tobacco shop, putting change into his pocket. Ah, I know him. It's unmetaphysical Estevez. The tobacco shop owner has come to the door. As if by divine instinct, Estevez turns around and sees me. He waves hello. I shout back, "Hello, Estevez." And the universe falls back into place without ideals or hopes, and the owner of the tobacco shop smiles. And that was January 15th, 1928. So, I hope you enjoyed this long video. If you did, please leave a comment. I'd be interested in reading it. Yeah. Death is a gang, boss.